All right, thank you, Belinda. And again, good morning, everyone. In fact, we've really had a thought provoking first day. We've had lots of questions that were asked. And in some ways, the plenary today really sort of brings together a lot of conversations that happened and that took place here yesterday. And yesterday I was looking at some of the scribes, and thanks, Iris, for this incredible scribes that you've been developing. I was actually reminded of my own experiences from all my past life. It was like all my years of work experience just kind of, reflected back here. And I'll share a story to kind of bring back to what was discussed at the first session yesterday. In one of my previous roles at the Center for Women's Leadership, our team was developing initiatives to address gender leadership gap, particularly the leaking pipeline of women leaving the workforce due to maternity and childcare. As you would expect, we all begin with data. So we started looking at, what's the data that's there to sort of see why are women dropping out of the workforce due to maternity and childcare. And trust me, there were countless reports from the consultants, from the human rights professionals, from the executive coaches, explaining why women drop out of the workforce due to maternity and childcare. And they all had advice on how and why they should come back. But here's what shocked me. And trust me, we really looked at all the data and the research that was available in the country at that point. But really, what shocked me is that there was not a single study that was conducted with the women who actually left the workforce. The entire world had an option and opinion on their choices, except them. So we actually started the research, and I think it was mentioned in the panel yesterday at the opening in terms of, that even as individual stakeholders, we are not a homogeneous group. So we started our research really speaking to pregnant women, women who were on maternity leave, women who were on maternity leave but have come back to the workforce, women who had children, was like a few months old to ones that were like 5 years old or 3 years old. Because we did realize that women or mothers or pregnant women were not a homogeneous group. And if you really sort of look at them as women, I think not a homogeneous group in there. Fast forward, last year, I was teaching a group of professionals, and they were very proud. And these were all business professionals from some 40 big, large multinational companies. And they were really proud to share how they had submitted recently their modern slavery statements. I got really curious because, as in my current role, I don't get to be on the field as much as I would want to be. So I started asking them, their interactions with the laborers, with the communities that they engaged with. Guess what? None of them have ever met once a forced labor, and they were all businesses who had actually submitted their statements on modern slavery and what their businesses were doing to address that. Their stakeholder engagement had been outsourced to consultants, to intermediaries, and third parties. And I think what I'm trying to say here is, over the years, things haven't really changed, and the way that we sort of look at it, it still remains the same. And I guess it's moment really like this that we have to ask, is stakeholder engagement really a bridge between businesses and communities, or it's another process really to maintain control? Does it lead to actual influence, or it's really just a ritual, it's just an input, it's just a process? And it's interesting because this term stakeholder engagement really comes from management theory, first introduced by Freeman in 1984 as a way of businesses to think beyond shareholders and consider the wider ecosystem of people who influence or are affected by their business decisions. And it included in some ways rights holders, even though the term wasn't used. Those days, it was also a direct challenge, really a direct challenge to Milton Friedman's shareholder primacy model, which everybody was talking about at that point. But honestly, if you really look at it, it's a concept that's really been taught across several disciplines and different fields, right? I mean, for media, they say audience is the key. For designers, for innovators, they always say, keep your users at the center. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and we were trained to engage with diverse communities to understand different perspectives and to co-create solutions respecting social, cultural, and economic context. And I'm saying here all of these different disciplines, but and they may or may not have used the term stakeholder engagement, but really it is what about engaging with people who you are working for, people you are designing for, people you are developing solutions for. And over the years, we have obviously seen the concept of stakeholder engagement really gained global significance, I think really embedded into some of these CSR frameworks, sustainability standards, and human rights regulations. And in some ways, I guess what started as a voluntary best practice has now become a regulatory, has become a regulatory expectations really codified in frameworks, including, we heard many of these acronyms yesterday, UN Guiding Principles, so UNGP, CSDDD, CSRD, TNFD, GRI, all of these different disclosures really require businesses to engage with stakeholders. But I guess it's one of that field, it's one of that issues that remains where we see really the biggest trust deficit in the business and human rights space. At the annual forum last year in November, stakeholder engagement was one of the key issues that kept coming in across different sessions and across different conversations. So, has it really, really shifted the power? Is it leading to influence, or it's just an input? And I think, honestly, if engagement really truly worked, why do we often see an empty chair at decision making tables like ours right now? Well, sometimes the chair gets filled, but then there's never an enabling environment where they can actually come and speak and bring their perspectives comfortably, honestly, as well. So today, I don't want to ask here who's at the table. I think the question that we're trying to answer here is who isn't at the table. So we'll start, and we would love to hear from you. So if colleagues can put the Mentimeter here, what we would like you to do is we would love to hear from you. Who do you think should be at the table today, and who do you think isn't? So if you could please scan the code, and then let's hear what our audience feels here. So as expected, I guess some of the questions that we have started seeing, some of the responses here: young people, rights holders, survivors, indigenous populations, big corporations, multinational corporations. We do have business representatives here among the panel. Policymakers, decision makers. Great. I think let's, as it's populating, I think what we're trying to say here is if these are the tables, they're only set for those who already hold the power, then honestly, really, engagement isn't really shifting powers. It's really maintaining it. So how do we challenge the status quo? How do we engage rights holders? I mean, everybody said, a lot of people said here, we need rights holders, and again, in different categories here, but we need rights holders, but then also to ensure that they're not just consulted, but actually their input is taken into consideration and they're able to shape decisions, the corporate decision making as well. How do businesses, investors, and policymakers really create engagement that leads to shared accountability and not just information exchange? I've gone to communities, I've heard them, and I've come back, and I'm going to continue doing what we are doing. So not to have that kind of a conversation or an information exchange, but really to co-develop and ensure that this engagement leads to shared accountability. Now, these are not easy questions, not by any means. These are very tough questions, but I guess that's why we are here today. And thankfully, I don't have to answer them. I only get to ask these questions as a moderator. Well, we have an excellent lineup of speakers, and thank you again for joining us today. So I guess I'll start, you looked at some of these responses that we said we need to have, other people here at the table that we were discussing stakeholder engagement. But maybe we'll start with a very brief question and for you to reflect on. Given your experiences and given your diverse background, we have Kilaine who bring in an investor's perspective, Walter from your experience as a private sector, from a private sector experiences, and James, you've been advising businesses on how to do this the right way. If you could all maybe start and take about 2 minutes just to sort of help us understand what do you think are really the primary reasons for distrust in business commitment to environmental and human rights? Ghislaine, perhaps we can start with you.
Thank you, Harpreet, and thank you also for setting the scene and that great introduction. I have to say, it reminded me also about one of my experiences that led me to start working on sustainability. In 2010, I spent some time for an organization in India that fights against child labor. And I did a legal research on all the legislation that protects children. And there's a lot of legislation, but what I learned from the person that I was working with is that policies, they're all dead letters. It's of course about the implementation, and stakeholder engagement, of course, is one of the tools for that. Distrust, I think a couple of reasons, I think, or causes come up into my mind. Well, first of all, historical misconduct and controversies. We have seen a lot of there are, of course, major issues on environmental degradation, violation of land rights, community rights. So, and these are impacts, large impacts, and it takes a lot of time to rebuild that trust. Lack of transparency and disclosures from companies' side. Companies are maybe hesitant to disclose challenges that they face, and so they decide not to disclose those, which could lead to suspicion. Inconsistent practices. Not walking the talk, and that is also maybe linked to greenwashing, where you overcommit related to sustainability actions and don't do what you say you want to do. And lastly, I think, we have various stakeholders, we live in different worlds and we don't know each other. So then that makes it also maybe difficult to trust each other. So that is very important, to get to know each other, to understand the practices from each segment. You could say, how does a bank work? How does an NGO work? Because I think that will build trust. And in the Netherlands, we have a saying, vertrouwen komt te voet en gaat te paard. And if I translate it, trust arrives on foot and leaves on a horseback. So it's very difficult. It's hard to earn trust. It's easy lost and difficult to re-establish. But engagement, accountability, legal responsibility, and collaborations are, of course, some of the ways how we can rebuild trust.
Thanks, Ghislaine. I have lots of follow-up questions on that, but I'm going to pause for a moment. But Walter, let's just hear from you. Why do you think, what are the primary reasons for distrust in business commitments?
Okay, so thank you. So morning, everyone. I think my personal background is all in the private sectors. So, and for the current observation from my experience in the private sector, I think the first important point I would like to call out is I agree with your point you said about the transparency, because it's very easy to making a commitment. However, when you come into the practical levels, and I think the company from the senior management level and also from the operation level, they feel quite hesitation to implementation, because they just worry if I do something wrong and will that bring any damage to my brand reputation and whether I lose any, business order. So that's the most concern as a private sectors. They want to do, but they still feel like anxious and worry about that. And the second point I'd like to call out, I think there is a chance, I guess, from the NGO or media, they think about, the private sector, they do got the PR department or government relation department. They do quite a lot of advocacy to the government and also the NGO. But sometimes I think the perception is the private sectors, these departments are trying to persuade the benefits. Just really to think more from the company's level, but really to think more about the social goods. So this is a lot of things about imbalancings when you're doing advocacy to the government, especially to the local government and the community level. So that also brings some trust as well. But last but not least, I think a lot of perception on private sector, because a lot of NGO and media will say, hey, you are the private sector, you are looking for money, you are driving for profits, right? But I think the perception is talking about whatever you do, you're always looking for money. You are looking for the, how to say, the profits. And I think this is a fundamental perception on the other party looking at the business or the private sector, how they should behave. Because nothing wrong as a business because they need to earn money, right? But what the other people around the private sector, they will say, you are not doing the right thing. So I think there is a fundamental mindset difference and making the trust happen. So I think that's the three key summaries from my learnings. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Walter. I think some thought-provoking questions here. And I think what was really interesting in the way that you said, we all sort of look at stakeholder engagement somewhere as a risk management tool. But what you're also saying is even if when businesses do this, they're thinking, how it may actually end up, bringing in more reputational risk to them and how it could be even riskier in that. And I think that's an interesting point, and we'll come back to this in the conversation. But James, if I could pass it on to you and hear what you have to say about this.
Thank you, Harpreet. So I think for me, I think there's the fact that there never was trust to begin with. And really the system is kind of operating as it should be, as Walter was saying. Like it's the profit motive, that drives businesses in society. And we've been trying to, drive this normative shift, with the UNGPs. And we can see, like Ghislaine was saying, like the historical controversies, they seem to be the only thing that have really driven business action. We can look at Thailand. So I've been based in Thailand since 2017, working. I come from an NGO background primarily. This only just moved to the private sector recently, and so I've seen from that perspective. I have a human rights background, and seeing Thailand, become a pioneer. They're always saying Thailand is the first country in the region to have a national action plan. But where did this come from? This came from global controversy around the seafood sector, and it's NGOs who and journalists who are usually leading the charge in exposing these controversies. And then, the businesses, as Walter was saying, then the businesses don't trust those NGOs because they're afraid of letting them in and exposing more controversies. And so when those businesses, they do begin to change and they begin to have, social sustainability departments to begin to hire people from the human rights sector. But then those people are, very constrained in what they can achieve. They're working in a small department. There's usually only a couple of them, and then they find they're kind of working against the interest of everybody else in that business. And then you can also see that when a business will, make big commitments to say, we're going to, completely eradicate child labor or forced labor from our supply chains, by 2025 or 2020, 2030, and that year comes and goes, and then the business is like, oh, actually, okay, we need to move it again. And this is what, the public are seeing. They're only seeing these controversies come out. And then the business finally responds, and then legislation comes along, and businesses respond. And as you were saying, they'll have they'll publish a modern slavery statement and be very proud of it. Oh, we finally got our statement and our policies published. But how does it turn into action? And then the NGOs come along to kind of say, okay, we're going to see to what extent is this being implemented. Oh, it's actually not really being implemented. And then you have this cycle of distrust between civil society and businesses. So I think we're still trying to move this system away from what its original purpose was, which as Walter said, it was to create profit. And I think this is so there never was trust to begin with, and as Ghislaine said, it's easy to lose. So every time you have a controversy, they're being set back, and when they put out these big commitments, I think everyone is naturally very skeptical of what they mean. And those commitments are often made by a PR and marketing department who are disconnected from the human rights department, and they can't convey the complexities of human rights violations or why forced labor is happening in their supply chain. This is all people will see from the outside. It's a very kind of simplistic narrative, which I think then is also frustrating to the human rights practitioners within that business.
Great. Thanks, James, and thank you, everyone. I think, we're really starting to raise a lot of other questions in terms of, we're talking about trust deficit, but was there ever a trust? And how do we really break this vicious cycle of distrust that keeps happening? You make commitments and then you don't really deliver, or for whatever reasons, the businesses are not able to deliver. I think what I personally see is, one of the key challenges that also remains is this lack of dialogue. And I think what we have not been able to really, at least that's where I see, and that's where we see that what we've really not been able to do is to bring affected communities and stakeholders together with the businesses on the same platform. I think sometimes it feels like all of these conversations are happening in their own different corners, and people are really not able to come together and have this conversation and have a meaningful, constructive dialogue. So I think how do we then break this cycle is where we start talking, because I think and you've all raised issues around transparency, accountability, but I think now I'm trying to remember who said, but you may have sustainability teams, but if those teams are not empowered enough, and if they don't have enough financial resources, because all of this requires, also in terms of different resources, capacities, it requires technical capacities. What I'm hearing is it requires resources. So if you don't have that, even within businesses who have big sustainability teams or have started to address, then how do you actually make it happen? So I think it's an interesting conversation and the way that we've started. But Walter, let me just maybe start to kick off the conversation with you. Your members work across different industries, different geographies, and you're sort of looking at operations here in Asia. And in all of these different geographies, your members are actually engaging with multiple stakeholders. But let's again, bring back the conversation in terms of, who are these people who actually are your stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders that you're speaking to? But also from your own experiences across these different industries, different geographies, who do you think is missing from some of these assessments that your members are undertaking? Who doesn't get a say, and why do you think they don't get a say? And how do you think that can probably sort of push the agenda a little bit forward and bring them to these conversations? How do we really bring people at a platform where at least the conversations can start constructively, meaningfully? Where do you see these stakeholders are missing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a question. I think because we are a private sector business organization across 45 different sectors in different country and region, so I would like to categorize our member into two levels. One is multinational company and also the large corporation, for example, the Thai business in the stock exchange, for example. But another piece of our member base is more about small and medium-sized company in the global supply chains. And when we talk about the, stakeholder engagement, I will say a lot of these activity are only done into the multinational company and large corporation only. Because if you talk about human rights, impact assessment, talking about environment right, I think these two wording are too luxury for small and medium-sized companies. Because actually, before I joined ZS, I working for a factory, and I spent 9 months working 12 hours with the workers. And I can really feel and touch that these very high-level wordings sounds too luxury for the small and medium-sized company. So if you're talking about the small and medium-sized company, how do you do the supply engagement and the stakeholder engagement? That does not make sense. So I guess that's the point. To answer your question, for the large corporations, and they do a lot stakeholder engagement, and I think the major stakeholder is likely to be the investors from the capital markets, the NGO, CSO, and also from consumer and also the government. But also, don't forget the supply chain is also a very important part of the corporation. So the supply, especially the tier 1 suppliers, are the essential stakeholders to need to engage. But I think the weakness from the large corporation, I will say, it's difficult really to touch at a workers level. Because you can go to the factory to talk to the factory boss, but those, the kids, or let's say if there is a child labor, if there is like say forced labors, and you will not get a chance to really to talking to the workers. I think that's very difficult. So because I got a feeling like when I was sent my boss to one of my factories in one of the countries in Asia for 9 months, every day I need to talk to the factory's girls, and they're crying and they want to get a job. But I don't think the large corporation, you got the chance to talk to the factory workers in the ground, and you won't be able to hear the pain and challenges. So I guess this is the biggest challenges, and I think it's the missing part. So how can we realize the civil society or NGO to bring these workers in the ground, have a connection to talking with the corporation? And also, the second finding I would like to say, normally the stakeholder is coming from about the PR levels, the public relation levels, or ESG managers level. But how can we ensure that the CEO or chief sustainability officer or whatever you call the C-level person are really to see these workers' voice are really important. Otherwise, you are missing the most important part, especially from the human rights side. And come back to the small and medium companies, I guess they do still need to do some stakeholder engagement. I guess most of the time their stakeholders are their downstream customers, because a lot of customers from the human rights perspective, they will say, okay, you go from the audits, you do filling the questionnaire, and this is the only information they got from the customer, but they are not be able to empower to do the right stakeholder by themselves because they no money, there is no one get the training, because if the big company, they only give the training and resource to the big suppliers who have a large procurement volumes. But if I'm a small one, who I can help? I'm the person very, very, how to say, I really need to getting some help, but no one to care for me. So how can you empower these small and medium-sized companies to really to take some action? Also, this is, I would say this is a pain point as well. So I will pause for now to give some other reflection to the other panelists in here.
Sure.
Thank
No,
you.
thanks, Walter. In fact, in some ways you're raising some of very critical issues, but particularly here for Asia, where you do have a large number of small and medium enterprises. So how do we, even when among large multinational companies where we do have the resources, if you're not able to do it the right way even there, how do we then sort of start really bringing these conversations, and how do we really build capacities even among the small and medium enterprises? We do have later, I think, some sessions on small and medium enterprises, and we have some SME speaking. So perhaps it's a note to the moderators if you want to bring that conversation again. But I think what you're also saying here is, what I'm hearing is, in all of this engagement that's taking place, we are still not speaking to rights holders, and we're not reaching actually to affected communities or the workers or the ones who are going to be impacted the most by the operation. So you're looking at still in terms of your tier one suppliers, you're looking at still in terms of, I think in some ways incremental progress, but I think how do we then really pick the pace and sort of make sure that we also reach the workers or the affected communities in the end. Actually, James, I'm going to come to you with this because, we've talked about and we heard how many of these stakeholder engagements are now outsourced to some of these organizations and businesses, the way that you engage with. And you've been advising companies on some of these, issues as well. I think my question to you is, when these, and there's no problem and there's no issue around sort of businesses making money and having the profits, and I think the conversation is about profit with principles and profit, making sure that you're not abusing either people or the planet. I think that's what the conversation is really about. But when this stakeholder engagement is outsourced, James, how do you continue to ensure that there's ownership among the businesses still, even though it's been outsourced? And we understand all of this probably is difficult to do it as a business itself, while ensuring and maintaining financially competitive as edge as well. But what are some of the common mistakes that businesses make when they're outsourcing the stakeholder engagement? In your experience, have you had any experiences where it could have been avoided, but because we're not caring enough, and we're just kind of, really subcontracting our responsibility and our accountability to a third party? What goes in there?
Thank you for the question. So I think within Bode, we take like a very system strengthening approach. So we have the clients who come to us, they're self-selecting, and I don't think they're necessarily coming to us to try and avoid their responsibility. They choose us for a very specific reason. And so we kind of say to them, we've always talked about stakeholder engagement. First, you need to really take a very intentional step back and apply, a systems lens and look at where does this stakeholder sit? Like, they're not operating in a vacuum. They're operating within many different systems. One of them is within your system, within your supply chain. And, this can help a business, not just kind of dive straight in and say, okay, we need to get some workers' voice. You can't have the voice separated from the body and just have some kind of quotes appearing in a report, which is, removed from their context. And applying the system lens can help you, define, like, who are your stakeholders, identify your stakeholders. And, you have stakeholder mapping, which is, a very common activity that, a consultant may do. And that may even be just a desk review in the beginning. And I think that's also fine, because you really, shouldn't be rushing this process and just trying to, just try and tick a box and say, okay, we've consulted these workers, let's move on to the next action. Like, actually identify, okay, who are your stakeholders? And they're not necessarily just rights holders. So as Walter was saying, so a lot of our clients are also, big M&Es, big brands who then contract us to work with their immediate suppliers. So their suppliers are also stakeholders, but you need to then, categorize these different stakeholders. You have the rights holders and the duty bearers. And you have to understand, what systems are these different stakeholders operating in? And especially with regards to the rights holders, how are those systems, supporting them or failing them? And then you need to focus on, strengthening those systems and, figuring out how can you have, where does meaningful stakeholder engagement fit within that? So I think they need to be very clear on, what is the purpose? Like, why are you actually engaging in this? Obviously, if they're coming to us just because it's on a list of things they need to do, they're already, then no amount of consultancy will help you if you're doing it from the very, wrong intention. So, the intention behind stakeholder engagement, we can talk about whether it's achieving, accountability or readdressing power imbalances, but really you're trying to understand, a group of people whose, voices have not been heard before. And you want to understand that group in their context, the different perspectives and experiences that kind of, shape their world. You need to, approach with this kind of open mind. And then you need to have, a targeted intention with that as well. So are you trying to understand the impact of your business on this particular group? And if you're a large international brand with, dozens and dozens of suppliers all over the world, thousands of workers across the supply chains, you need to prioritize where are you going to focus your efforts, where are you going to have meaningful stakeholder engagement, because you can't achieve it through obviously endless surveys or audits, and as I say, just having workers' quotes removed from their context. So you need to really understand those groups, on a much deeper level. So whether it's look at the impact that you're having, whether you're trying to mitigate that impact or remediate that impact, and then work step by step, and approaching them with that idea in your mind of we're just simply trying to understand this group, and then we're trying to understand what is our impact and which systems are in place which aren't functioning correctly, or which of those systems are we responsible for in our supply chain, whether it is the tier one suppliers, whether it's local government or national governments or civil society. And I think so if you're, we talk about stakeholder engagement should be kind of baked into the HRDD process overall. It should always be kind of informing different activities. And if you think about, very specific activities, so if it's, for example, establishing or looking at the effectiveness of a grievance mechanism, because that's obviously one channel which you get some form of engagement, you get some form of dialogue, and you want to understand, how do we get this group to access this grievance mechanism? What barriers exist? But it might not just be about the barriers. You need to understand, the local culture about what are the impacts of why does this group not access a grievance mechanism? Is it better to maybe have something like social dialogue, like a more kind of open system that is proactive rather than having something like, a hotline or a suggestion box? Because these are often things you see in an audit where they'll say, okay, do they have a grievance mechanism? And it's just, okay, we have a hotline posted somewhere, but nobody's accessing it. And you want to understand, why is this group of workers not accessing this? But there's a lot that you need to understand about the context that they operate in. So there's a lot of legwork to do before you, kind of jump to that stage. And I think finally is, businesses can often underestimate what it takes to achieve meaningful stakeholder engagement. So as I say, it can't just be, a survey, but you want to understand a large group of workers. And, for example, we've had a contract where it was to interview 200 workers and to understand, what are their impacts. And we went for, in-depth one-on-one interviews. And this is a very, big kind of social research project that you might usually have a university undertaking or an NGO and, lots of people with expertise in social research. And a business may come, as I say, these departments have very small budgets, and they'll say, okay, can we have a project interviewing these workers? And they're probably thinking, oh, we can just do a survey in a couple of days. We will say, no, if you want to do meaningful research, to really get in-depth qualitative data and allow, the space for trust to build and have a meaningful discussion, then it needs to be in-depth one-on-one interviews, which It takes a lot of time, planning, and above all, quite a significant budget. So the businesses, they really need to understand, what legwork goes into preparing for meaningful stakeholder engagement.
Sure. Thanks, James. And I'm just, picking up on the last point that you mentioned about also sort of underestimating how much work it is and, how much more that you need to do. But let me just, bring it back. Which are the departments that you actually engage with? Because, we often see engagements, I mean, these kind of engagements only come either through the compliance team or through the sustainability teams. But the fact is, when people who are sourcing, and I'm thinking of, people who are in your procurement team, when they go back and they're going to have to fix a price with the farmer for a certain thing, are those people who are actually also built into these conversations and brought into these conversations, because it's not just about restricting it to sustainability and compliance team, which is often where we see who even understands stakeholder engagement in a right way, right? But when you have engagement with these businesses, do you see that they're actually making a real effort to not just have these in siloed departments within the organizations, but also really be able to build their own capacities of their own of their own human resources to sort of see that why is it important, and do they bring them to these conversations?
It's a really good question. And so to answer that, so in Bode we work also with AIM Progress, and I don't know if anybody's heard of them, but they are a forum of fast-moving consumer goods companies that kind of work together on a joint commitment of responsible sourcing. And all the representatives, who take part in this forum, they are from the social sustainability departments. But there's been quite a few sessions aimed at, responsible purchasing practices and, bringing in those people into that conversation. I mean, this is often kind of at the very beginning of that process of even engaging them, and for them to kind of hear this terminology, as Walter was saying, a lot of this terminology is very new to them, and, they're kind of being slowly sensitized to it. And I think you can see the reaction, when they learn about what impact it can have when they are putting purchase orders in, and we say, okay, the impact this has downstream, let's say in the garment sector, okay, you put in this kind of significant purchase order for, fast-moving fashion, and, look at the impacts this can have, in a garment factory across a multitude of factors. And there's a learning process, and I think like Embode really, approaches it as, we're looking at their organization as a system, and they need to strengthen those systems, which also means, cross-departmental dialogue. But it's a slow process, and we can also see a lot of frustration from, those sustainability departments where, just getting those purchasing people in a meeting, having them being available, is a challenge in itself. And I think it's still a very slow process, and I think it's becoming more normalized, and I think those kind of associations like AIM Progress are doing a really good job, because they're making it kind of a more normalized conversation and a more normalized participant to have those responsible sourcing people, part of those meetings. But it's still a long way to go, as I say, because you're trying to have a normative shift within that little system, and that itself is taking a long time.
No, thanks, James. And I'm sure, we'll have lots of questions follow up on there from, but let me, come to you, Ghislaine. And I'm particularly interested because, investors often rely on these reports, ESG metrics and company disclosures to assess engagement, right? In terms of, looking at all the acronym soup of our disclosures that we've just sort of talked about. But how do you really, as investors, assure and assess whether companies are engaging meaningfully with stakeholders, or it's just a checkbox exercise, and they're really filling the reporting requirements? How do you really assess that? Where do you find challenges? Where do you find gaps in getting that correct information, or the full information?
Yeah, that's a challenge, I would say. Just a quick note on Robeco. So Robeco is an asset manager, and we invest in listed companies. So imagine what Walter was saying, and James as well. For large companies, it's difficult to know what is happening on the ground. For an investor, as us, we are even further away. So it is, that is a challenge to hear what is really happening on the ground. So we have to engage with our companies that we invest in on stakeholder engagement, how they approach it, exactly what James and Walter were explaining. Maybe also good to mention that so we engage with our companies that we invest in, or we do that on behalf of our clients. Those are banks and insurance companies, and we do that engagement with our research specialists, SI research specialists, but also with the investment teams. Because I think that is important to mention, to have that internal stakeholders also have them also included in the engagement with companies on these type of topics. So, of course, we depend a lot on disclosures, but with active engagement, stakeholder engagement is almost always one of the engagement objectives that we have in our engagement programs. So normally we have we have up to 5 engagement objectives. We use international standards and frameworks that give us guidance, of course, in assessing stakeholder engagement and approaches. So that's the UN Guiding Principles, the OECD guidelines, but also sector-specific guidance. For example, from the RSPO, who has defined as well what stakeholder engagement should look like, but also for the mining sector, for example. And then we speak with companies. We want to see that there is board oversight on sustainability, including stakeholder engagement. We look if there are KPIs related to this topic. Engagement should be proactive, stakeholder engagement. It should be transparent and participatory. There should be indeed a two-way dialogue. It should be an ongoing dialogue. So these are all topics that we discuss. Of course, grievance mechanisms is something that we require, but also then that the company is reporting on the filed grievances, what did they do, remedial actions, etc. So one red flag, of course, is if the grievances are very low, the amount. And we really prefer companies that they do the stakeholder engagement themselves. We see, of course, that they use consultants, but they should also be themselves involved. They should explain to us, what did you do with the stakeholder feedback? How did it impact your policies, your operational management approaches, and etc. But coming back to the fact that we are so far from away from what is happening on the ground, it's for us very important to engage with NGOs, with trade unions, like in conferences like this, get connections. For example, I spoke with Robbie as well. I would like to organize a session on one of the, in the just transition engagement, for example, we require engagement with indigenous people. FPIC should be respected, but what does this really mean? And what is the, I think an engagement with an NGO that is focusing on this with our investment teams could give them more information of, okay, what does this mean in practice? And what are the examples that there were issues and how were they solved, and how can we include stakeholders at an early stage? So that is one area to get more information, and of course, indeed, collaborative investment initiatives, because these initiatives have often a broad network with stakeholder organizations as well. So that's our approach.
Sure. Thanks, Ghislaine. I think one of the key issues that you brought up, and I want to pick here, is on the board engagement. And I think, there's of course the guidance from World Economic Forum, the role of boards, and really guidance in terms of, boards to engage with affected stakeholders. There's been a lot more focus in the recent years, and we've seen a lot of advocacy for boards to engage with stakeholders. But do you think they actually ever go and meet stakeholders on the ground? Or is it like, the boards, in your experience, do you see boards really engaging with affected stakeholders? Or is it still the proxies, meet with 2 civil society organizations and then have done the stakeholder engagement as a board member? Because I think what we're also seeing more and more is that, the boards are becoming diverse, and you have, especially board members who are focusing on sustainability, at least those board members. Do you see them actually going to the field, ever meeting with the affected communities at all, or is it still? too far-fetched?
I think
a
that is
dream?
incidental, and when that happens, I think is mainly if there's an incident, if there's a big controversy like what we saw with Rio Tinto a couple of years ago, where also investors actually then required that there was a change in CEO and in senior management. And then, of course, and also required that, requested as well that there would be a structural engagement with the local communities, etc. So then, I think, then you see a change in the board commitment and also board involvement. I think on climate we see a lot more developments on that there are, for example, climate experts appointed in the board. On social, I have not seen that yet, but investors can also file shareholder resolutions, for example, requesting somebody with human rights expertise to be appointed in the board. We have done that on climate a couple of times, but this is something that we could do as well on human rights. What we see from the engagement with companies on human rights is it's not so much on board level, but I think James also mentioned it. We see more and more companies having human rights experts within their company, senior human rights experts, and building also their teams. Dedicated teams to work on human rights and stakeholder engagement. We see that especially in Europe. For example, in Germany, you see companies that have that. So I think that that is a great development, but we have to see it more.
True. No, thanks, Kelaine. And actually with that, let's move on to the second round of questions. But before we get into the second round of questions, let's take a moment also here to sort of shift the table here and the conversation that we are having here. We've been talking about rights, we've been talking about rights holders, but let's also try to hear from one. So please welcome Robbie Halep, who's going to join us here at the panel. Robbie is the coordinator from Rights Energy Partnership with Indigenous People. Robbie, if you could please join us here.
If you will allow me, just to make that message that rights holders are still not at the table in decision making. We keep it at that. Just to put that message across. But the discussions that were earlier discussed are indeed thought-provoking, and the question is there really trust? Because from our end, from indigenous peoples, it stems from the non-recognition of our rights and non-recognition of us as indigenous peoples with collective rights. And that sets the framework of how investments, how businesses are also being welcomed in our countries. That sets those regulatory frameworks that defines how businesses should act in states at the country level. No? So in terms of engaging with businesses, frameworks that are set in place are more looking at environmental impact assessment, but not social impact assessment. It's only looking at these physical impacts, but not looking at how rights holders are being impacted, and more importantly for indigenous peoples, how our identity, our continuity as peoples is also being impacted. Now, there was a discussion yesterday on the distrust is coming from, stemming from previous experiences, and that's quite true for many indigenous communities who've been host to these large projects, and the engagement that was only done with them was mainly not talking about the project, but baiting them with economic opportunities, employment, scholarship, establishment of clinics, and all that, but not really talking about the project, how it will impact their community, the displacements that would happen, and the impacts on the livelihood. Agreements that are made with the community, between the company and community, most often are not followed through. The community doesn't even have a copy of those agreements that are being made with companies when they give their consent for the project to continue. So in terms of holding companies accountable to these agreements, they don't have anything to hold to, because even those simple documents that needs to be given to communities are not provided. And it also, the distrust also stems from not being heard, no? The issues that the communities are raising in terms of impacts, continuing impacts of the project, the rehabilitation that's needed, these are not being heard. And then a new company comes in, continues the operation. It's a new engagement, again, new trust building with the community. And the point on it's all aimed at profit making. I do agree with that because having spoke to a number of business entities, no, these voluntary measures that are currently being adopted by companies to really measure their impacts is more of a realization on if they don't engage with rights holders, it would have an impact to the profit, to the consumers, and even to the investors. No, but again, it's not being done right. It's still a continuing checklist, procedural exercises for many corporate entities. It's more of a, how they call that, greenwashing exercise where you have these verification auditors who does this checklist for you, but on the ground, the situation is worsening. And I think the other point that I'd like to make out, again, going back to state obligation, is the increasing authoritarianism and also the shrinking democratic spaces for engagement, even if we want to really meaningfully engage with businesses, the risk of reprisal, the risk of harassment, the risk of killing is so high for many indigenous peoples and human rights defenders that you don't have that safe space to really have that meaningful engagement. The last challenge that I'd like to point out also is the proliferation of these consultancy firms, community development firms that are being contracted out by companies. I'm not hitting on you. No, but in one specific case,
Not you, right?
this is a mining project. This community has been consistently saying no to the mining project because they know that it would have, having learned from the experience of their neighboring community, the impact is so grave. So they've been consistently saying no. The company has been deploying so many tactics until finally what they did was divide and rule. Divide the acquisition of consent to areas, so they clustered the areas, and then took in a community consultancy, a community development consultancy firm to start the engagement with the community, but not to tell them about the project. It's again to know what are your needs and priorities. Then the company came in and then used that information to bait the community to say yes to the project. That's not the way it goes. No, that's not the way it goes. It's not meaningful engagement, and it's not rights-respecting engagement. What we call for is that we are not clustered as stakeholder. What we call for is that you engage with us because you recognize that our rights will be impacted. And we start with that. No, we start with that. We're not just simply stakeholder in the projects that you're implementing.
Sure. No, thanks, Robbie. And I think, again, raising some of the critical questions and really to sort of reflect back on some of the issues that were raised here earlier in terms of, how do we also, we hear all of these challenges, and I think particularly the, issues around risks and security of defenders. And I think in the region, there has been an increase in the number of cases, attacks against defenders in the recent times, and particularly sort of in the context of business-related human rights and environmental abuses. But if we really, I think let's take this conversation and let's take the stage in terms of, so how do we do it better? Because I think what we're hearing is there are all of these challenges. We heard some of the challenges here from businesses, of course, we heard challenges, that you are mentioning here. We also heard a lot of challenges and issues and problems yesterday. But again, I know that, you're not representative of all the rights holders here, and I do understand that, we would love to hear more, and we would love to have more and more rights holders into the conversation of decision making and not doing a checkbox exercise with sort of, bringing in one. But if you really think, but if you could advise, if you were to advise businesses and really think of practical, actionable key steps and try and break it down, instead of looking at how can businesses really shift their engagement approaches. You did mention about, how they're starting, and it's not the right way to do this, but how do they really shift their engagement approaches to ensure that there's a genuine inclusion of indigenous voices, and that it's not just the input, what we mentioned earlier, but, also to sort of really, to be able to shape the decisions. How can businesses really do this? What are some of the steps that you would want, James comes to tomorrow as as this consultancy firm, but or one of us businesses go to you and seek your advice. How do we do this the right way? So what's the right way, if you have any guidance on that? Just a very simple question.
In our engagements, because we've been supporting some corporate processes in developing their performance standards, particularly on indigenous peoples, what we've been calling for is one, go beyond the legal framework that's in place at the country level and look at international human rights standards when doing when setting standards for the company operating in different countries. Because we know that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a general lack of non-recognition of indigenous people's rights in the region. So go beyond what states are recognizing and look at international human rights standards and make sure that company policies and standards are aligned to that. The second point is also, like what's mentioned yesterday, capacity building is not one way, it's two ways. It's both internal within the company, but also within the community. It's important that in the company, you really know who you're engaging with. Because a concrete example that I'd like to give in line with this transition to renewable energy is now the increasing threats to indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation or in initial contact. This has a separate set of protocols that you need to look at when facing projects that will have an impact to indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation. And this is the case in a nickel mining in Indonesia, where the mining is right smack in the middle of where these indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation are, and threatening their existence and their continuity. And our call there is there are no-go zones for indigenous peoples, and one of the no-go zones that we could recommend is in areas where indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation are located, where it's identified that they are there. It's identified that that's their route in relation to their way of life. All engagement should be ceased, and there shouldn't be any contact, because any simple contact with indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation will be a big threat to them and to their community, because it exposes them to unnecessary risks to their health and also to their lifeways. The other one is also knowing that free, prior, and informed consent is not equated to yes from indigenous peoples. It could also mean no. And we need companies to also respect our right to say no. In line with the recognition that we do know that this project will have an impact to our territories, and we owe it to the future generations to keep our territories intact. Are we going to pass on an ancestral domain that is already so destroyed that there's nothing left there for the next generation to stay on? And the other one is we should minimize using indigenous peoples for, how would you call that? Not advertisement, but promotions, the support that's being given to indigenous communities. I do appreciate one response from mining company. This was on the landslide that happened in Papua New Guinea, where there's that indirect impact of the operations of the mines to the landslide that occurred. And when we raised that issue to them, silently, without any media announcement and all that, they supported the indigenous community to be able to declare that landslide area as a burial site, because indigenous peoples in that area will not be able to move out unless they do the ritual to declare that as a burial site. So silently, without any fanfare, the company responded to those concerns from the community. And that's the kind of engagement that we would want with companies: respectful, continuous, meaningful engagement. And you have a line there where indigenous peoples can directly raise their concerns and know that it's a safe space, because we wouldn't want also that our concerns would put us at risk in terms of our safety and security as Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders. And lastly, engagement with Indigenous people should be collective, not at the individual level, not at just with our traditional governance, but you need to make sure that the engagement is also voices of women, youth, persons with disabilities, other marginalized sectors within the community are heard. No, it could be through focus group discussions, but also collective discussion with the community.
Sure, no, thanks, Robbie. And I think, again, lots of messages here, but what I'm really taking, one of the key messages here is that you have the right to say no. And, just because we are conducting and we are sharing information, which obviously what you mentioned initially is, there's very little information, actual information about projects and about the impacts that's being shared, but also to ensure that, once you have the free, prior, and informed consent doesn't always result in a yes. It could result in a no. And just to kind of respecting that the communities have a right to refuse, right to decline. But then how do you then sort of, go from there, and how do you work within those spaces? Do you continue to engage with communities and try to build trust over a period of time? Or I think what you are here saying is also if there's a no-go, if that's what the communities want, then don't try to work around in different ways. So I think lots of messages here. We do have about 20 minutes, so I know that we have a second round of questions for all the panelists here. But I think maybe if we could take a few questions from the floor before we come back to the final sets of questions for the speakers. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Introduce yourself. Please be brief so that we can take a couple of questions at the same time. Introduce yourself, and if you could ask your question, and if you have a question to a specific panelist, please let us know. Okay, let's see the raise of hands. There's one here, there are three there, and that's one here. Maybe we'll start with one here. We'll take one from the center. We'll come back to you in the second round, and here. Sir, if you could please, yes, you could start.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for panel discussion. I'm Kosa from Cambodia. I'm working for the non-government organization. It feels that since yesterday I joined it, a very significant and comprehensive information sharing among these stakeholders. And then today also I heard very important comments from our panelists. They mentioned about engagement. Back to this yesterday, we were talking about generally about disaster, about any part of the problem. But more deeply than this, our work, we work directly with the survivor of human trafficking, modern slavery, and it's the part of this because of migration, and the root cause of migration because of disaster. There is this very significant change in my country as well, because that not only indigenous people, but some marginalized group, they are the part of modern slavery right now. So back to this, it seems that in my slogan here, we say that our vulnerable community, they cannot go anywhere. They go into the water, crocodile. They go into the forest, tiger. Out of the city, a lot of the issue happen to their life. So they have no way to go right now, because that they are facing all the challenging, they're facing all resist. The most important right now, NGO is the part of working for giving, supporting charities, while the private sector working for income. And the government, they are accountable for anything else for the communities. But how can we make sure that engagement are the part of as standard, like last panel discussion? Why we cannot looking about that here, one of common standard for every people into private sector to be applied with this standard, NGO apply with this standard, government apply this standard, so the last benefit to the community or vulnerable group. For example, child safeguarding. Is this one of standard from UNCRC?
Please shorten and just come to your question, and then we'll take a couple of more questions.
Yes, thank you. The question asked to all panelists that how can we apply this common standard for all stakeholders to be a part of this engagement? Second question, it related to the last session you mentioned about the framework and monitoring from the part of stakeholder. How can we have any our system can include all stakeholders to monitor together for any part of implementation or result of the responding to that the need of the community or vulnerable the community? Only two questions from me. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think there was a hand here. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm the mining practitioner and from Mongolia in Baikama, and I would like to say that I have experienced in community engagements and sustainable development stakeholder engagements, and from my point of view, that building trust somehow we could build in terms of the meaningful stakeholder engagements. Meanwhile, the society itself really dynamic, and in terms of the local communities, for example, in Mongolia, the Hoden communities really depend on the weather condition. If the weather is good, they will be really nice. If they get like storm, they will be very angry. So it's like social, we are talking about the social re-engineering when we talk about stakeholder engagements. Within this point, I really, last couple of years, I've been engaging in business and human rights projects and programs and conducting due diligences. And within that, I found out that the civil societies and international organizations such as UN and trade unions are all being leveraged between these stakeholders is really crucial for this point in time. On the other hand, when you talk about the business society itself, it's really shifting, creating value, not only it produced the time the society aiming to build value only to their shareholders. Now transition to build broader stakeholders together with the stakeholder contributions, build the value in order to, of course, combat the climate change. So within this context, I would like to ask the Klein, what will be investors' input supporting this civil society or leveraging bodies to get building trust and building a very strong stakeholder engagement framework of the business communities. It's really important to get keeping help of the business ecosystem within the supply chain and within the communities.
Sure.
That's
Thank you
it.
very much. I think,
Thank you.
Elaine, that's a question directly for you, but we'll hear if anybody else wants to answer. I think there was a hand raised here.
I'll try to be short. My name is Miguel Proença. I work with UNFPA. I will start with a word of appreciation for our priest and for mentioning that women are not an homogeneous group, and I think that's something definitely worth discussing under a human rights lens, especially when we talk about gender equality and equity. My question is around, Arpreet was talking about actions. My question is around incentives. We are addressing the trust deficit. Are we creating the right incentives for the private sector to engage more in human rights? And one panelist also mentioned profit. There's also obviously an issue with profit from human rights advocates. And my question is, will a company, a private sector company, ever be able to fully satisfy the human rights community? And one question for the investor.
You're now taking advantage of having the mic.
And will that company ever be interesting for an investor?
All right.
Thank
I think we've, instead of actually 3, we now have 8 questions to answer. So let's try to be brief here. I don't know, Ghislaine, there were 2 questions to you. And if you could just be brief, and we'll try to have another round of questions.
Maybe I start with that question. So we have various sustainable investing strategies that are specifically focusing on companies that are, for example, contributed to specific SDGs, etc. So indeed, those companies would be included specifically in these investment strategies. So we have those strategies on top of regular strategies. If I understand the question correct from the lady from Mongolia, how to build a more, how to improve industry business approaches towards stakeholder engagement. So we as an investor, we can engage, but of course, if we do collaborative engagement, we are much stronger. So there are various initiatives. Climate Action 100 is, for example, an initiative that engages with the mining industry, where stakeholder engagement is specifically one of the indicator that we engage on. So I think that is an avenue. But also contributing to policy developments, specific guidance, industry guidance, where we can provide input from an investor perspective on this specific topic on stakeholder engagement.
Great. Thanks. James and Walter, if you want to add to both the questions that were being raised. You want to start? Whichever, but if you want to maybe try and respond to the one, the gentleman here.
Yeah. So I think there were kind of two questions there. There was one about having engagement as a standard, or having a standard approach to engagement from NGOs, government, business. So they all have a different kind of approach and how to, I guess, have like a common standard for them. So, I mean, not to kind of like sell the value of consultants again, but I think one of the values that, you know, we can bring in this kind of space is translating the different frameworks from one group to another. So, you know, each of these groups are obviously speaking very different languages. And I mean, the benefit of, like, say, Embode, for example, everyone at Embode has a background in human rights. Like, say, I come from an NGO background. And, you know, we can help translate, you know, for that business. So the business who's very far removed from the context of where the rights holder is, we're able to translate, you know, these high-level human rights concepts into something that is, you know, meaningful and practical at the kind of stakeholder level. Let's say we're talking about like a supply chain business. So for them, what does it mean when we say this, you know, tier one supplier has to have a standard that is aligned with an international standard? And it doesn't always help for us to approach them first with those frameworks, because it's something that translates on a day-to-day basis into, you know, the HR processes. And we can see that often, you know, because it's something that's usually kind of imposed on them, you know, in the contract with their brand, and the brand will say, okay, you need to follow this code of conduct we have. And then we can look at the code of conduct or the operating procedure of that business and see they've just copied and pasted. But the staff don't really know what this actually means. They don't know the reasons behind it. And it kind of goes back to the point of intention. And, you know, when Robbie was saying about if the intention is wrong, is saying about the consultant firms coming in and they're trying to sell a project or coerce a community around, then obviously it's wrong from the very beginning. So I think it's, you know, you having an intermediary who can see through those different layers. And, you know, in Bode, you know, we have like a roster of like national associates who are based in those countries. So it's not just, you know, like me I'm from the UK originally. I don't, you know, fly into another country and kind of explain to these stakeholders. We have someone from that country who can translate these concepts, who's from that background, to a supply chain business, and then also do the same in reverse. You know, we can translate data and engagement, and data we've, you know, been able to get from those engagements back up to the business and help them transform into, you know, concrete action, which is usually the hardest part. You know, when you have a lot of this data and input from a community, and, you know, within Bode, we're usually talking about labor rights. You know, we haven't touched on land rights, so don't worry, we won't be getting involved in that, or maybe we should. So, you know, a business can usually be overwhelmed by the data they have. And yeah, you've got these groups that aren't homogenous. And what do you then do with that? It's often helpful to have an external view to translate that back into something. But obviously, you know, we have our part to play in ensuring that we're, you know, independent and non-biased, because we're obviously then, you know, condensing that data, and, you know, possibly things are being missed out. I'll stop there.
Sorry, can I just actually add on that? And I think, you know, when we look at these standards and when we look at these frameworks, I mean, to me, I think all of these standards and frameworks are the baseline. But eventually, you know, you do need to understand and contextualize, because again, I think we have to still sort of bring it back that, you know, any of the stakeholder, any of the countries, I mean, it's impossible to implement exactly same process in many different contexts all the same time. And I think that's where one of the key challenges is sometimes we try to standardize too much. And I think that's where you lose the importance of, you know, looking at, again, who your stakeholders are and, you know, who your rights holders are, in what context, in what kind of a policy and regulatory environment are, you know, are the businesses operating, you know, what are the kind of relationships that businesses have. So I think as much as I think standardization works, I think to me it's also about, you know, how do you adapt to the contextual ground realities as well. Walter, do you want to respond to any of the questions raised?
Sure. I
Got about
probably, yes.
7 minutes left.
Sure. So mainly I will touch the question the gentleman asking about incentive, because I'm probably in a better position from the private sector to talk about. I do agree that there is a fact we maybe ignores that what you, as a like say community, what you see, and it's different from what a company is seeing. Because we are seeing two different things. The mindset is different because that's the fundamental things we need handle for that. Because as CEO, as a corporate ESG manager, whatever call that, how they perceive the human rights will bring a benefit to the business. I guess that's the question we need to be sorted out at the first step. And also, how can we ensure the community or NGO, how they can position themselves to see, okay, this is my friend, or this is not my enemy, because a lot of perception from the CEO or the corporate thing about, okay, they are making the trouble for our life. So I think that's the fundamental, the first thing we need to sort it out. But come to how can we resolve the problem? Because we are not only talking about the problem, but how to handle for it. I think from my personal view, I think there are two things we can talk about. Can we try to talk about if you don't engage with the community and your stakeholder, what is your financial loss could be? So try to put these things into something financial implication, which the CEO as a profit-making company, they always talk about the money, the EBITDA, the ROI. So how can you have a business case to telling the language the CEO, the procurement people can understand? I think that's the way you can do that. And the second thing is more about something around, you might do one or two small projects to have more meaningful engagement with community, because you cannot roll it out to all the stakeholders. So you do one or two like pilot projects, deep dive to see how they work, and you provide opportunity to really talk to the community. It's a kind of like a little bit like a dating. You cannot get to know someone and then you marry in the second day, right? So you spend maybe 1 week, maybe 1 month to go to the cinema, to have something to drink, to let us know each other better. Then you can crack on for the next step. I guess the easy way we can, check out for the situation. So I will pause for now, just caution the time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure somebody's thinking of a dating app idea now for this particular engagement as well, but let's see here. But I think, again, some of the, these are again some of the steps that we're thinking about, how do we take it forward? I know that we only have about 5 minutes left, and there were quite a few hands raised. You don't get to ask Belinda a question. You can ask anyone. You have the entire panel, but maybe let's just, there was a hand raised here and here. If you can just, I'll actually cut you within 30 seconds. So be brief. I think this lady raised her hand before, and then you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tina. I'm from Bosch. We are a multinational Tier 1 supplier, and I'm also responsible for corporate communications in ASEAN. And I just maybe want to give the group something to reflect on, the opportunity to reflect. The first one is on the role of communications in stakeholder management. And we use multiple disciplines to tell our stakeholders what to think about rather than what to think. And for communications professionals, it's really a balancing act of trying to position the organization as commercially viable, yet socially aware. And we want to be able to create a louder share of voice for certain critical issues in order to move to policy discussions, right? And the second is on dialogue. The goal of stakeholder engagement is to be able to improve the status quo, to make continuous improvement second nature to the organization, whether that's for your internal stakeholders or external. It's good to open up opportunities for persuasive discussions between decision makers and affected individuals, but in saying that, it becomes now a responsibility to define what is fair versus what is reasonable. And in line with both communication work and stakeholder engagement, the outcomes of these persuasive discussions also need to be economically viable. Otherwise, we will be stuck in the dialogue stage and all of our efforts will be, for naught. Yeah.
Thank you for that reflection, sir, please.
Thank you for the stories and your wisdom. My name is Rakesh. I'm with Bureau Veritas. I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Lin and to the colleague who's representing the indigenous rights here. With regards to two concerns with stakeholder engagement, missing out on some stakeholders perhaps? And secondly, on the fatigue, where the same stakeholder has been approached by different businesses at different times. How about the topic of transparency of stakeholder engagement to audit standard setters, SEDEX, Amphori and others? Do you foresee a possibility where all companies that go through an audit have to disclose transparently identified stakeholders? And when these stakeholders are not suppliers and employees, then summary of the stakeholder engagement that took place with the community. Well, there and the geography doesn't change. And if standard setters, let's say, cannot take that courage because of whatever political reasons, then how about indigenous communities? When the community goes through an engagement by a particular company, if there's some funding, make it out transparent. We were approached by this company, engaging on these aspects. This is what we publish. This is the third-party research available. Next time somebody comes, hey, have a look at this, and then let's talk about the rest, yeah? Thanks.
Thank you very much. You both have 30 seconds each.
We've actually just recently concluded our convening on looking at the certification verification schemes, taking in auditors to audit the social and environmental standards set in place by multi-stakeholder platforms of companies. And we do have critiques on that process, particularly on how audits are being done. But in that discussion also, indigenous peoples have been putting out precisely the idea that you were saying, the respect and recognition of indigenous peoples-led impact assessment in partnership with credible institutions. It's also the recognition that indigenous peoples can conduct their own monitoring and reports, and for this to also be respected and looked at by companies. Just quickly on the incentives, if I could respond to that. Let's stop that mindset that we need to incentivize private sector for them to do their obligation to respect human rights. There's already a lot of incentives that are being provided to the private sector, no? And I think let's look at it from the line of their obligation to respect human rights. They say engaging with indigenous peoples, with rights holders is time-consuming and expensive, but on the other end, like what he was saying, it would have an impact not only to the profit, but also to investors, no, in terms of the risk that it provides to the company. And there's a study by Oxfam actually on this one, on how if you're not engaging correctly with communities, this is the cost that the company would take on. And we would not be in this planetary crisis that we are in now if things were done right at the onset, if it was not driven by profit, but rather sustainability.
Thanks, Robin. In fact, we didn't get to talk about the impacts and the dependencies, but perhaps for another session, Walter.
So to answer your question, I think ideally I understand from your point, you are from the certified body, right? So it would be nice in the future, maybe there is some standards or framework to ensure there is a quite clear frameworks or how to say standards. We can ensure the transparency of the stakeholder engagement can be met. But my personally, I would say, still about your dating story, you can put some best practice guidance to tell how the men need to dating with girl, but it's more about your interpersonal story. Because I don't want that stakeholder engagement to be something like tick the box. Because if you change into the standard, that's fine. That is the good thing. But the side effect is about if you want to come to a format or tick box, that could be a kind of like a homework. It's more about how can you personalize your engagement with the community, because there is different like material topics, different sectors you need to touch on. It's more about story to bring the stakeholder into your table to be part of your family community rather than to say this is standard. So there is a pro and con. And I think we will let everyone to think about what's the best way we need to moving forward on that.
We could probably even have like a full forum or full conference just focused on how do we actually do this better. And I know that I have to close the session. Belinda, I'm going to give you 15 seconds for your question. But we're not sure if you're going to be able to answer that.
Okay, it'll be a 15-second question and a plug. I will say that one of the things that is very, very tricky is, as we said, there are social experts that are working within companies. climate experts, I mean, there are lots of experts that are engaged, and the regulatory frameworks for all of these things keep changing. So just a question. How does a company practically, I know we've heard lots of examples, but let's say I'm a medium-sized company, I'm not a multinational. Where do I begin? And I think I know there may not be any answers to these questions. There will be trainings from 11 o'clock, so please do attend those.
I did not realize this
in
was a
meeting
pitch.
room A and G. I changed it to a pitch because
But
I only
thank
have
you. No,
15
but I
seconds.
think what you're raising is a really important question in terms of, where do we start and how do we start? And I think we'll take it from there. But maybe let's start by, sort of really turning the tables. And we're just going to close with this another quick Mentimeter. And we would love to hear from you. If you were to redefine the table, what would be one fundamental shift? So I think, Belinda, what you're also saying is, where do we start? What's that one fundamental shift that we need to take, that needs to take place? And while we have our audience here responding to these questions here on the Mentimeter, I don't know if my panelist wants to go ahead and say, what's that one fundamental shift that you would want to make from your perspective?
Well, I think we talked a lot about risk management, I would say, but there are a lot of opportunities as well. So for us as an investor, we could develop a sustainable investment strategy focusing more on specific rights holders, and also ask them to give feedback on that strategy or feedback on that engagement. So be more involved in our investment decision process.
And also the designing process. So
And the
not just
designing
like,
process,
have a
yes.
strategy and say, this is how we're going to do it, but really use and work with them and use their knowledge and wisdom to inform how do you design this strategy. Walter.
I think my takeaway probably to think about, we should have mechanisms which to enable the private sectors to really talking to the community, to really understanding who you are and your expectations, i.e. from the private sector, they are looking for the profit-driven, but community looking for the value-driven. So how can you to balancing that, to put the thing in the table? So is there any kinds of the volumes, like working papers or mechanism we can create? I think this is a question mark for me, and I think this will be a fundamental to, overcome the gap. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I kind of go back to what I was saying at the beginning about having a system strengthening approach. And I think like one example, and we had a project related to this, was looking at child labor in cocoa in Indonesia. And, one company was asking us, oh, what should we be doing on this now? And really we were kind of saying, focus on West Africa, actually, because that's where the problem is still really persistent. In Indonesia now, I think it's like 98% universal enrollment in education. Like when we were speaking to stakeholders who were NGOs and groups on the ground, and when we did consultation with children who were in cocoa farming communities, they weren't really involved. It wasn't something they could define as child labor anymore. They were all going to school, and it's like, why was this happening? This wasn't necessarily because of business action. This was because those systems have been strengthened for universal access to education. So it's not just the business again doesn't exist alone in a vacuum and doesn't have to take action just by itself. It has to kind of take a step back and look at the system overall. Where does the business responsibility begin and end? Where does it begin with another system, with the local government? And try and not solve everything yourself, basically recognize your role within that system.
Sure, thank you very much. And I see lots of responses coming in here, some very interesting. But again, I think, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your experiences. I think, Robbie, you have the last word.
From indigenous peoples, if we were to redefine the table, we need to shift our concept of development from a very top-down, profit-driven and extractivist approach to putting people and planet at the center. And that means also putting indigenous peoples in decision-making and supporting indigenous peoples-led initiatives, the same with other rights holders whose rights are currently heavily impacted by project activities, and corporate accountability.
Thank you very much. So we do have some tips and some practical guidance on how do we do this. Thank you again for this conversation.